October 23, 1958. A violent seismic shock hits No. 2 colliery in Springhill, Nova Scotia. Rescue teams descend into the mine expecting to find bodies. They do not yet know that 19 men are still alive below them. 6 days later, a rescuer named Blair Phillip is crawling through a tunnel at the 13,400-foot level, a depth most people will never come close to in their entire lives. He's not looking for survivors. 74 men are already confirmed dead, and at this point the teams around him are recovering bodies, not people. He presses a glass jar to the stump of a broken, compressed air pipe in the tunnel wall and holds his headlamp up to the opening so the light will carry through to whatever is on the other side. On the other side of 160 feet of collapsed rock, 2 men who have been in total darkness for 6 days, with almost no water, see that light come through. One of them shouts into the pipe, "We're alive in here. How about some water?" 12 men are alive behind that wall. 9 days later, 7 more will come out from a level even deeper. Men who had been underground for 8.5 days, kept alive by a miner with a broken leg who sang to them in the dark. And for Springhill, this wasn't the first time. Springhill sits on the Chinecto Isthmus in Cumberland County, Nova Scotia, a compact working-class town that in the 1950s had somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000 residents, around 1,500 of whom worked the mines. In Springhill, mining ran in families. Most miners followed fathers and grandfathers underground, learned the sounds of timber under stress and gas near a fault, and carried that knowledge their whole lives. They also carried the knowledge of what the mine had already done to the people who came before them. On February 21, 1891, a coal dust explosion tore through the joined tunnels of No. 1 and No. 2 collieries. Eyewitnesses described it moving like a tornado through the dark passages, and it killed 125 men and boys, some of them as young as 10 years old. Queen Victoria contributed personally to the relief fund. Mass funerals drew mourners from across Nova Scotia, and when it was over, the town grieved and went back to work because the mine was all there was, and most people stayed. The children of the men who survived 1891 grew up knowing what the mine had done. Some of them became miners themselves. Some of those miners would be underground 67 years later, on the night of October 23, 1958, when it happened again. But before that night, there was another night to get through first. 5 minutes past 5 in the afternoon, No. 4 colliery. A string of linked coal cars, a trip, in the language of the mine, was being hauled up the slope toward the surface. As the cars climbed, ventilation air blowing down through the shaft caught the fine coal dust on top of the load and lifted it into suspension, spreading it through the tunnel like an invisible cloud. Then 6 of the cars broke free from the hoist cable. They tumbled back down the slope, left the rails, and smashed into a 2,200-volt power cable running along the tunnel wall. The arc from that cable ignited the suspended dust, and a sheet of blue flame shot 200 feet above the pit head, flattening the bankhead building and killing 5 men on the surface before they had time to move. 118 men were underground. The first rescue teams, known as dragermen, named for the Draeger self-contained breathing apparatus they wear, descended immediately and ran into heavy carbon monoxide within 100 feet of the surface. 2 rescuers died before the teams were forced back. 4 days after the explosion, a Royal Canadian Air Force plane flew in oxygen from Halifax and landed on Springhill's airstrip at night. There were no runway lights. The runway was lit by the headlights of hundreds of townspeople's cars, summoned by a loudspeaker truck that had driven through the streets calling them out. Inside the mine, a supervisor named Conrad Embry, whose own father had survived the 1891 explosion, organized trapped men near compressed air pipes to slow their intake of gas. Survivors later described tearing their shirts into strips, soaking the cloth in rusty groundwater seeping from the rock walls, and breathing through the wet fabric as they felt their way toward the sound of rescuers in the dark. A rescuer named Bill Ferguson had his breathing mask knocked off during the effort. According to those who were with him, he said, "Get me my mask. I've got to go back." He didn't come back. 39 men were killed in the No. 4 explosion. 88 were rescued. The mine was sealed and never reopened, and among the men who came out of it, a dragoman named Harold Brine, who had descended into a burning mine to help bring others out, and a miner named Byron Martin, who had been underground when it hit. Both went home to Springhill, both went back to work, and both ended up underground in Number 2 Colliery 2 years later, on the night the earth moved in a way none of them had felt before. Before getting into what happened on October 23rd, it helps to understand what kind of force these men were dealing with, because what struck Number 2 that night was not a fire or a gas explosion. It was the earth itself. A mine bump is what happens when pressure that has been building in deep rock finally releases. When coal is removed from a seam at great depth, the surrounding rock is suddenly under load. Pillars of coal hold the roof up, but those pillars have limits. When one fails, the roof and floor slam together almost instantaneously. An open tunnel becomes solid rock in less than a second. Debris blasts sideways through nearby galleries, and the shock travels through the earth for miles. Number 2 was not a shallow mine. Its slope ran more than 14,000 feet into the earth, reaching a vertical depth of more than 4,000 feet, among the deepest coal mines in the world at the time. Small bumps were routine there, common enough that miners had developed a tolerance for the shudder underfoot. But what hit on October 23rd was something else entirely, and the men inside had no warning it was coming. 174 men were underground in Number 2 Colliery on the evening of Thursday, October 23rd, 1958. Shift had been running normally. Around 7 that evening, there was a small shudder in the earth, felt, noted, and ignored, as bumps usually were. At 8 minutes past 8, the real event hit in 3 distinct waves. Floors heaved upward, ceilings slammed down. Men were thrown off their feet before they had any idea what was happening. Eardrums burst from the pressure change. The air turned instantly white with stone dust so thick that headlamps went dark, a foot from your face. And for a long moment, there was nothing to see, and no way of knowing what was still standing and what had already collapsed. A miner named Herb Pepperdine, who was 35 years old at the time, described it afterward. "There was a bang in me ears. It threw me back quite a ways. My face blew up like a balloon. You couldn't see nothing for stone dust. Your light shone through, just like a fog." Doug Jukes was thrown 7 feet through the air and buried to his chest in debris. The man working beside him, Les Bouchard, was killed. Leon Melanson was buried to his neck. Gorley Kempt came to consciousness pressed against the ceiling of what remained of his gallery and had to worm through a narrowing gap before it closed completely. 81 men made it out in the first 24 hours. 74 were confirmed dead. That left 19 men still missing somewhere underground, alive as it turned out, but unreachable behind hundreds of feet of collapsed rock in conditions that would have broken most people well before the rescue teams could get to them. The 19 men who were still alive in the mine had ended up in 2 separate groups, cut off from each other and from the surface by the collapse. The group of 12 were trapped near the 13,400-foot level behind a rockfall estimated at roughly 160 feet thick. Harold Brine was among them, as were Gorley Kempt, Caleb Rushton, and 9 others. They had no food, almost no water, and no way of knowing whether the rescue teams above them even knew they were there. The group of 7 were 1 level deeper: Herb Pepperdine, Doug Jukes, Byron Martin, Garnet Clark, Frank Hunter, Curry Smith, and Maurice Ruddick. There was also an 8th man in their chamber at the start, a miner named Percy Rector, whose arm had been pinned at the elbow between 2 timbers that had become load-bearing in the collapse above them. The timbers couldn't be moved. A saw couldn't fit in the space around them. There was no way to free Percy Rector, and the 7 men in the chamber with him understood that. They stayed with him anyway, in the dark, in the heat, with the weight of the mountain pressing down on all of them. The chambers both groups were trapped in were roughly 9 meters long and less than 1.5 meters high. No one could stand. There was no room to pace or stretch, and nowhere to go except deeper into the dark or back into the wall. The only sound was breathing and the occasional settling of the rock, and eventually things that were harder to listen to. The earth at that depth holds heat, and the temperature in both chambers sat close to 85 degrees Fahrenheit. Not lethal on its own, but combined with no water, almost no food, and air that was gradually worsening, it became one more thing steadily working against them. The darkness was total. Once the cap lamps died, there was no difference between eyes open and eyes closed. There was nothing to do but wait in a space that felt smaller every hour. The group of 7 had a single smashed canteen between the 7 of them, and they rationed what was left using the cap of a pill bottle as a measuring cup. Some of the men, according to survivor accounts, eventually drank their own urine. On the 3rd day, Herb Pepperdine crawled across the chamber floor in complete darkness and found, by smell, a dead man's lunch can lying somewhere nearby. Inside it was a chocolate bar. He brought it back and split it among the living. They had no way of knowing whether anyone on the surface still believed they were alive. No way of knowing how long they had been down there, or what day it was, or whether the rescue teams above them were getting closer, or had given up entirely. They waited. By the 5th day, Percy Rector was delirious. He could be heard talking quietly about going to fetch water for his wife from a spring somewhere. A miner named Maurice Ruddick sat beside him and talked to him quietly and steadily until he stopped responding. Percy Rector died on the 5th day. 6 men remained in the chamber, and the rock had not moved. Maurice Ruddick was 46 years old, had a broken leg from the initial bump, and had 12 children at home waiting for him. He was a descendant of black loyalists who had come to Nova Scotia after the American Revolution, and on the long trolley rides down to the working face, he had always been the one who led songs, gospel, popular music, anything with a strong enough melody to carry over the noise of the mine. In the complete darkness of the crushed chamber, with a broken leg and a dead man 30 feet away and almost nothing left to drink, he kept doing it. He led the group of 7 in hymns and prayer. He made up verses. When Garnet Clark turned 29 years old underground, spending his birthday in a collapsed coal mine, in total darkness, not sure whether he was going to survive it, Ruddick sang to him. Years later, Ruddick said, "I cried in the darkness, but I made sure that nobody else heard me. It might have broken their resolve to live." The dragermen had been working toward the trapped men since the night of the bump, advancing through ground that was still under pressure and still shifting. Every foot of progress required shoring up the unstable rock before moving forward, and multiple routes had to be abandoned entirely when the earth moved again. Progress was measured in days. By October 29th and 6 days after the bump, almost nobody on the surface still believed anyone else was alive down there. Blair Phillip reached the section of tunnel near the 12's location and pressed a glass jar against the stump of a broken, compressed air pipe in the tunnel wall. He held his headlamp up to the opening, and on the other side of 160 feet of rubble, Gorley Kempt and Harold Brine saw the light come through and understood what it meant. "We're alive in here. How about some water?" The rescue tunnel broke through to the group of 12 at 2:25 in the morning on October 30th. All 12 came out alive, 6 days after the bump. That same day, Premier Robert Stanfield and Prince Philip, in Nova Scotia for a scheduled visit, came to the pit head and watched the last of the 12 emerge. Officials told reporters there was no reasonable basis to expect further survivors at this depth, in these conditions after this long. The dragermen kept going anyway. At 4 in the morning on November 1st, 8.5 days after the bump, 206 hours underground, rescue teams made contact with the group of 7. Herb Pepperdine was the last man out. Rescuers told him, according to accounts from the time, not to look at what they passed in the tunnel on the way up. Maurice Ruddick, with his broken leg, was carried. No more living were found after November 1st. Douglas Jukes, asked by reporters what he most wanted after 9 days underground, said, "A 7-Up." Maurice Ruddick was asked the same thing. He said, "Give me some water. I'll sing you a song." The 1958 Springhill bump was the first major international story in Canada, covered by live television, CBC cameras at the pit head, feeding footage to networks across North America as the 12 were brought out. The story circulated worldwide, and in the weeks that followed, celebrity attention poured into the town. The Ed Sullivan Show invited the miners and their wives to New York, with Sullivan donating $1,000 personally to the relief fund. A Georgia governor named Marvin Griffin offered the survivors a vacation on Jekyll Island, and when Griffin learned that Morris Ruddock was black, he insisted Ruddock be housed in a separate trailer, assigned a separate beach, and kept from the main events. He reportedly refused to shake Ruddock's hand. The white miners said they wouldn't go without him. Ruddock told them to go and accepted the terms himself. He and his wife and 4 of their 12 children attended their own events and swam on their own section of beach, lodged apart from the rest of the group for the entire trip. In February of 1959, a reader's poll in the Toronto Telegram voted Morris Ruddock Canada's Citizen of the Year, 51% of the vote across more than 20 nominees. He donated a portion of his song royalties to the families of the men who had died in the mine. He died in 1988 and is buried in Hillside Cemetery, Springhill. In 1959, folk singers Peggy Seeger and Ewan MacColl wrote what became known as the Ballad of Springhill, which has since been recorded by Peter, Paul, and Mary, the Dubliners, and U2, who performed it at 15 shows on their 1987 Joshua Tree Tour. Its refrain, "In the town of Springhill, you don't sleep easy. Often the earth will tremble and roll. When the earth is restless, miners die. Bone and blood is the price of coal." Number 2 was sealed after the bump and never reopened. Dominion Coal closed all of its Springhill operations, putting around 900 men out of work, and the town's population dropped by more than a quarter in the years that followed. In 1967, the federal government opened a medium-security prison on the edge of town, and for a long time, it became Springhill's steadiest employer. The Carnegie Hero Fund Commission recognized the rescue effort with a special resolution and gold medals mounted on a bronze plaque. The old mine workings now heat part of the town through a geothermal system. Harold Brine, dragerman, survivor of the 1956 explosion, one of the 12 rescued from behind the rockfall in 1958, died on July 28, 2023. He was 91 years old, and he was the last living member of the 19 men who came out of Number 2 colliery alive. When he died, there was no one left who had been underground that night. The mine is still there. It's sealed, it's silent, and it's still warm.